We begin tonight with the increasing pace of witnesses testifying to the impeachment inquiry as more witnesses get added to the deposition schedule every day. John Bolton will not testify voluntarily. That's what his lawyer said today in response to a letter from the House Impeachment Investigative Committees requesting John Bolton's voluntary appearance at a deposition next Thursday, November 7th at 9:30 a.m. John Bolton's lawyer, Charles Cooper, told NBC News, quote, "Bolton is not willing to appear voluntarily." And then the lawyer added, "I stand ready at all times to accept service of a subpoena on his behalf." But that same attorney, Charles Cooper, represents Charles Kupperman, who was subpoenaed by the impeachment inquiry. And that lawyer then brought an unprecedented lawsuit to ask a court to clarify whether his client should obey a lawful subpoena or obey the president's demand not to testify, even though his client no longer works in government. Donald Trump's no longer his boss. He is a private citizen, just like John Bolton. And the president of the United States has no legal authority to issue an order to a private citizen. But all private citizens are subject to subpoena. And so the lawsuit that John Bolton's lawyer has already brought on behalf of one of his clients to avoid testifying to the impeachment inquiry is another unprecedented, frivolous legal maneuver thrown in the path of the impeachment inquiry. The first hearing on that lawsuit is tomorrow. Attorney Charles Cooper's clients are eventually going to be ordered by judges to testify to the impeachment inquiry. And so John Bolton is eventually going to have to tell his story under oath in public after first possibly submitting to a closed-door deposition. And the big reason John Bolton has for not wanting to do that, the big disincentive John Bolton has about testifying publicly, is the financial incentive he has to save all of his most colorful and most condemning stories about Donald Trump for his book, his big book, which he is reportedly already working on. And the value of that book increases as long as John Bolton can hold on to his Trump secrets, which also means that the value of that book declines. If John Bolton is forced to reveal some of those secrets publicly in testimony to the impeachment inquiry long before he can publish his book. So it seems unlikely that John Bolton will show up for his deposition next Thursday, even if he's hit with a subpoena in the meantime. In addition to requesting testimony from John Bolton, the impeachment inquiry has sent requests for testimony to John Eisenberg, the top lawyer for the National Security Council, and Michael Ellis, one of Eisenberg's deputies, asking them to appear for depositions Monday, November 4th. Fiona Hill, President Trump's former top Russia aide on the National Security Council, testified earlier this month that she met with John Eisenberg twice at John Bolton's urging after she was worried by Rudy Giuliani's involvement in the Trump administration Ukraine policy. Fiona Hill quoted John Bolton calling Rudy Giuliani, quote, "a hand grenade who's going to blow everybody up," which is exactly what Rudy Giuliani apparently has done. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman told the impeachment inquiry yesterday that he twice reported his concerns to John Eisenberg about President Trump's dealings with Ukraine, including the president's July 25th phone call with the president of Ukraine. Two current State Department officials, Christopher Anderson and Catherine Croft, testified in under oath depositions to the impeachment inquiry today. Christopher Anderson served as a Ukraine expert advising former U.S. Special Envoy to Ukraine Kurt Volker. Christopher Anderson was followed in that job by Catherine Croft. Christopher Anderson, according to his opening statement, told House impeachment investigators that Rudy Giuliani prevented the Trump administration from strengthening cooperation with Ukraine. Christopher Anderson described a meeting he had with John Bolton on the topic of having senior White House officials engage more with Ukraine. John Bolton identified an obstacle to better engagement with Ukraine. He cautioned that Mr. Giuliani was a key voice with the president on Ukraine, which could be an obstacle to increased White House engagement. According to Catherine Croft's opening statement, she first learned of the Trump White House's plan to hold up Ukrainian military assistance to Ukraine during a July 18th Office of Management and Budget meeting she listened in on by video conference. An OMB official told the group that White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney had placed what they called an informal hold on the $391 million in aid to Ukraine, Catherine Croft testified that the reason given then for the hold on Ukraine aid, was that the order came at the direction of the president. Catherine Croft testified under subpoena today, according to an official working on the impeachment inquiry, in light of an attempt by the White House and State Department to direct Catherine Croft not to appear for her scheduled deposition. NBC News has learned more about Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's deposition yesterday. NBC News is reporting Colonel Vindman told House impeachment investigators on Tuesday that a White House meeting between President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky, as well as the delivery of nearly $400 million in security and military aid, was contingent on Ukrainian officials carrying out investigations into Burisma, the Bidens, the 2016 election, and CrowdStrike, NBC News has learned. Colonel Vindman said in his opening statement, "I did not think it was proper to demand that a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen, and I was worried about the implications for the U.S. government's support of Ukraine." According to NBC News, two sources familiar with the testimony say that Colonel Vindman later went further than his opening statement by drawing a direct line between the deliverables for Ukraine and the multiple investigations. Leading off our discussion tonight are Democratic Congressman Rajah Krisnamoorthi of Illinois. He's a member of the House Oversight Committee and the House Intelligence Committee. He attended the depositions of both Christopher Anderson and Catherine Croft today. Also joining us, Jill Wine-Banks, former Assistant Watergate Special Prosecutor and MSNBC legal analyst. And Evelyn Farkas is with us. She's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration and a former staff member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. She served on the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee for 7 years. She knows Catherine Croft, who testified today, and Evelyn is an MSNBC national security analyst. Congressman, first of all, to today's depositions, did they deepen your understanding of what has been happening within the administration on Ukraine, and in what ways did they do that?
Thanks for having me on, Lawrence. I think that it's fair to say that they fleshed out further kind of the evidence supporting the whistleblowers' allegations and the scheme to basically pressure the Ukrainians to initiate bogus investigations of the president's domestic rivals in return for aid and potentially a White House meeting as well. And so I can't comment on the specifics of the testimony, but these individuals, made statements that were completely consistent with others' narratives and their testimony as well. And
what can you tell us about Tim Morrison and the report tonight that he has resigned? He's scheduled to testify tomorrow.
Well, I think that's more of a reason that I hope that he will show up tomorrow. Because he will no longer be within the president's employ, and he'll be you could say he's a private citizen at that point. And who knows? Maybe he'll even have some documents with him. I'm not sure about that. But the point is that I think that cutting ties with the administration makes it less likely that the president could compel him not to show or not to produce documents of his own.
And Congressman, there seems to be a more rapid pace now for scheduling these things. I mean, we watched the House of Representatives, for example, in effect negotiate to schedule Robert Mueller's testimony for months. The negotiation took months. It was then scheduled for more than a month in advance of when it was announced. We're now learning today that John Bolton is told, we want you to come in 7 days from now. It seems like this pace is something that we haven't seen before.
No, we haven't. And it's a parade of career public civil servants. I call them a parade of patriots, quite frankly, people who are putting their necks on the line. They hire their own attorneys, so they're coming in at their own expense. They're basically coming forward out of conviction to tell the truth and to tell the truth about misconduct that they witnessed. They are incredibly commendable. And just yesterday, you talked about Colonel Vindman. There's a gentleman who is currently in the National Security Council, currently in the White House, and he came forward yesterday to testify. Again, a very compelling witness, just like, for instance, Mr. Taylor, Ambassador Taylor from last week.
And Jill Wine-Banks, I want to bring you in here on this legal question. The most absurd thing I've seen develop here legally in relation to the committee's actions is John Bolton's lawyer, on behalf of another client, asking a court to clarify, what should we do here? We have a subpoena from Congress, and yet the president is telling my client not to testify. The client is a private citizen. I can't think of a more ridiculous thing to bring to a judge. And nothing like that ever happened in the Watergate. There wasn't anybody who went to a judge and said, do I obey a congressional subpoena? I'm a private citizen, or do I listen to the president about what to do on this?
No, it never happened in Watergate, and it shouldn't be happening now, because the answer is obvious that a subpoena trumps, no pun intended, trumps anything else. They have a legitimate right, and of course the court opinions have now been very clear that the Congress is conducting a legitimate, lawful, constitutionally mandated impeachment inquiry, and even without the vote, which will now happen and I'm sure will pass, but even without that, it was totally legitimate, and they should be allowed to use the subpoena power, and people come in and they testify, and they're in contempt if they don't follow the subpoena. So it's very hard to get a court to issue what's called a declaratory judgment, because there's not really an issue. There's no real fight going on. And you have to have two opposing sides to get the courts to rule. But I think they did a good job of phrasing it, and maybe the court will say this is ridiculous. You have to, of course, abide by a subpoena, and I think they will.
Evelyn, you know some of these witnesses. Yeah. What is your sense of how this evidence is developing now?
I think it's really interesting, Lawrence, because, of course, there's been an acceleration of witnesses. We can't even keep all their names straight. I mean, I can, because I know many of them personally.
I have my list here beside me.
Exactly.
It's a very long list.
But the point is, these are all hardworking professionals. You know, Catherine Croft, who came forward today and testified, she knows Ukraine inside out, and that's partly why she got the job.
Let's just pause over this.
Yeah.
She is a current federal government employee. She's in the State Department.
Yeah.
She's on the payroll.
Yeah.
And she got her subpoena. She went.
Right.
She just there was no confusion about what to do. She doesn't care what Pompeo says or what Trump says.
But part of it is, I think, because she's a civil servant, she has a sense of duty. Really, Ambassador Ivanovich, Marie Ivanovich, remember, she was the first one to go. She's the senior one. What I heard from inside the department was that she was looking, she wanted to stay in the government so that she could do that, so that she could look out for other people. I don't know, I haven't corroborated it with lots of people, but my sense was from people I've talked to that she felt responsible. So she wanted to stay in the government
as a model of what to do in testifying, even when you're working in the government.
You know, she's senior, she has her pension, she can afford, you know, let's say financially and otherwise, to put her leg out there a little bit. And that's actually then, that emboldened a lot of others. Bill Taylor is in the same situation as she is, more senior, can afford to take the risk. But for these people who are in the middle, Catherine Croft has a great career ahead of her. You know, for her to make a misstep without that cover would have been more dangerous. I want to pause on Tim Morrison, because I worked with him, and we talked about him, actually, you and I. You asked me, I think, once whether he would testify. He worked for a long time in Congress. He worked actually for Mac Thornberry, who's retiring, so with the House Armed Services Committee. I suspect that he left, he was a political appointee. I think he left the White House so he could speak more frankly, so he could testify. That's my bet. You know, policy-wise, a lot of Democrats probably would want to say negative things because they don't like the policies that he worked hard to advocate, anti-arms control, et cetera. But as a colleague, I worked well with him, and I know that my sense is that he understands his constitutional obligations.
Jill, what do you make of the pace that Congressman Krisnamoorthi tells us has definitely picked up?
I think it's a natural reaction to the fact that the evidence is mounting so fast, and people are coming in and they're getting leads from everybody who testifies. So it's like pieces of a jigsaw that are really coming together and fitting together very well now. The evidence is so strong, it's impossible for Republicans to defend on the facts. The law is against them. So, you know, you always say if the law is against you, argue the facts. If the facts are against you, pound the table. There's nothing left for them to do but to do that, because the evidence and the law are so strong, and every one of the people that you mentioned in your opening fit together and make a unbelievably strong case. You can't just take the phone call out of context. Yes, the phone call on the face of it is really damning to the president. He said, I need a favor, though. There's no question that he was asking for something of value, which is a Hobbs Act violation. It's soliciting a bribe. It's a terrible thing to have done. It endangers our security. It endangers Ukraine's security. It helps only one person, and that's Putin and Russia. It all goes back to Russia. So it's really getting to be strong, but you need it in context where you say, well, for months before that, Rudy Giuliani was trying to get them to make up a investigation, to make up evidence that doesn't exist.
Congressman, we got reports yesterday indicating that Republicans were trying to get the name of the whistleblower out of the colonel yesterday in his testimony, even though he testified in his opening statement he doesn't know who the whistleblower is. What were their tactics today? Was it anything similar to that? Was it obstructionist, or are they spectators today?
I felt that they were a little more subdued, quite frankly. I think that at this point it's been made clear by Chairman Schiff and also the counsel for the witnesses that they're not going to allow for anybody to get them to intentionally or inadvertently release the names of any people that could be the whistleblowers. As you know, the whistleblowers are protected under statute and regulations from being exposed. And we also know that President Trump and his allies in Congress want to expose this whistleblower so that they can then retaliate against him or her. And if that is done, not only will it harm the whistleblower in question, but it will create a tremendous chilling effect for anyone else who wants to come forward with evidence of wrongdoing who might be in the rank and file in our government. The American people devised the whistleblower system for one reason alone, and that is they want rank and file people to come forward so that they can get good government. And the reason why the Trump administration wants to create this chilling effect is precisely to get people to avoid doing that. And we can't allow that to happen, so we're not going to allow people to burn this whistleblower.
Congressman, quickly before we go to the break, I've had two members of the committees who've been in the depositions who have said on this program that they believe Gordon Sondland is coming very close to risking perjury charges based on what they've seen in the direct contradictions of his testimony under oath by other witnesses. Do you share that sense that Gordon Sondland could be in legal jeopardy?
I wouldn't say it that way. What I would say is that at least my impression of his testimony was that he wasn't able to recall a whole heck of a lot with regard to a lot of his encounters and conversations. And so that kind of lack of memory, selective amnesia, and perhaps evasiveness are issues. But that being said, there are a lot of other data points now that we have with regard to conversations, meetings, and so forth that help to fill in the picture.
Congressman Raja Krishnamurthi, Jill Wine-Banks, Evelyn Farkas, thank you all for starting us off tonight. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.